In 1820, a sperm whale struck a whaling ship called the Essex and split its hull wide open. The ship went under in minutes. The crew drifted across the open Pacific for months afterward, and some of them made choices no person should ever have to face just to see land again. That whale did something almost no sailor had ever documented before. It circled back. It came a second time, on purpose. But that whale never learned to do any of that from a boat. Boats are new. Whales are not. Long before the first canoe ever touched water, long before any human stood on a shoreline and looked out at the sea, whales were already living entire lives out there. Full lives. Complicated ones. Lives with memory, with grief, with sound. So what were they doing all that time, with no ships to notice them? You have to go back. Not thousands of years. Millions. 50 million years ago, a whale had legs, 4 of them. It looked more like a strange, long-snouted dog than anything you would call a whale today. Paleontologist Hans Thewissen spent years digging through rock in Pakistan to prove it, piecing together a creature called Pachycetus from fragments of skull and ear bone. That ear bone is the giveaway. It is shaped almost exactly like the ear bone inside a modern whale's skull, and it is how scientists know this land animal belongs at the very root of the whale family tree. Picture that for a second. Your body, if you trace it back far enough, shares a distant branch with cows and hippos. A whale's body shares that exact same branch. Somewhere around 50 million years ago, one branch stayed on land. The other walked toward the water and never fully walked back. A few million years later came Ambulatsis, a name that literally means walking whale. It still had 4 sturdy legs and webbed feet, but it hunted the way a crocodile does today, lying low near the shoreline, waiting, then lunging. It could walk on land if it needed to, but the water was clearly where it felt most at home. Somewhere further down that same line came Basilosaurus, an animal that had almost fully lost its legs, keeping only 2 small useless ones tucked near its tail, a leftover, a signature of where it came from, carried forward for no functional reason at all, simply because evolution rarely erases everything at once. Why would any animal give up solid ground in the first place? Food, probably. Safety, possibly. The shallows were full of fish and short on the predators that patrolled dry land. Generation after generation, the animals that spent more time in the water survived a little better than the ones that didn't. Their legs shortened. Their nostrils crept upward, toward the top of the skull, so breathing meant less lifting of the head. Their tails thickened and flattened into a fluke built for powerful, sweeping strokes. None of this happened because any single whale decided to change. It happened because the ocean kept rewarding the ones who were already a little more suited to it, over and over, for millions of years. By the time actual whales as we would recognize them existed, humans did not exist yet, not in any form you would recognize. Whales had already mapped the oceans before we had a written word for water. But that isn't even the part that should stop you in your tracks. Some whales developed a sense that has no real equivalent in your own body. Toothed whales, like orcas and dolphins and sperm whales, evolved a way of seeing with sound. Air pushed through their nasal passages produces rapid clicks, and those clicks pass through a fatty, rounded organ in the forehead called the melon, which focuses the sound into a narrow beam. That beam travels outward, bounces off anything in its path, and returns through the whale's lower jaw to the inner ear, building a kind of sound picture of the world. A whale using this sense can tell the difference between a fish and a rock in complete darkness, from a distance you could never manage with your own eyes. Even sleep works differently down there. A whale can never fully lose consciousness the way you do each night, because breathing is not automatic for it the way it is for you. So one half of its brain rests while the other stays alert, keeping watch, keeping the animal moving toward the surface for air on a steady rhythm. Then the 2 sides swap, half awake, always. For 50 million years, that was simply what rest looked like, long before anything with sails needed to worry about running into one asleep at the surface. And it built a culture, not a human one, their own. Orcas, for instance, travel in family groups called pods, and different pods develop their own distinct set of calls, almost like separate dialects, passed from a mother to her calf. A calf raised in one pod grows up making sounds that a calf from another pod might never make at all, even though they are the exact same species living in the exact same ocean. That is not instinct. Instinct would sound the same everywhere. This is learned, this is taught. This is something closer to what you would call an accent, quietly passed down for as long as anyone has been listening. And someone eventually did start listening. In the late 1960s, a researcher named Roger Payne got hold of recordings of humpback whales made by a naval engineer, and what he heard changed how an entire species was understood. The whales weren't making random noise. They were producing patterns, phrases, movements that repeated and built on each other the way a piece of music does, and those patterns shifted slowly across years, almost the way a song evolves as it's covered and reinterpreted over time. Long-running research into sperm whale clans has since found something similar. Families identified by their own signature pattern of clicks, a kind of surname passed down through the maternal line. Here's where it gets harder to look away. Long before humans built anything that could float, whales had already built roads, not roads made of stone or wood, roads made of memory. Many species migrate along nearly identical paths every single year, sometimes thousands of miles, from feeding grounds near the poles to breeding grounds near the equator and back again. Calves learn these routes by swimming alongside their mothers, generation after generation, so the path itself becomes a kind of inheritance, carried forward not in genes but in experience. A whale today may be swimming a route its ancestors were already swimming before a single human had ever built a raft to cross a river. But the hunting, the singing, even the roads, none of that is the strangest behavior. This one goes deeper. Whales were never waiting around for boats to give their lives meaning. They hunted in cooperative groups, herding schools of fish with coordinated bursts of bubbles that some pods use like a net, and they grieved. Female orcas and other species have been observed carrying a calf that did not survive, pushing it through the water for days at a time, refusing to let go. Researchers who have watched this happen describe it in careful, restrained language, but the behavior itself is hard to describe as anything other than mourning. And that is the strangest part of all this, isn't it? Because everything you just learned, all of it, existed before there was a single human witness to see it happen. The songs existed with no one recording them. The culture existed with no one studying it. The grief existed with no one there to name it. Whales were never performing for us. We simply arrived late to a story that had already been running for tens of millions of years. What changed then is not the whale. What changed is that we finally built something that could reach far enough into their world to notice, and that noticing came at a cost. The ocean whales evolved and was a quiet one, filled mostly with the sound of water and the calls of other animals. Ship traffic changed that. Low-frequency engine noise now travels for extraordinary distances underwater, and it overlaps with the exact frequencies many whales use to find each other, to coordinate a hunt, to keep track of a calf. Researchers studying this have found whales calling louder, or for longer, or more often, just to be heard over a soundscape their ancestors never had to compete with. When boats did finally arrive, they weren't ships at all. They were narrow dugout canoes and skin-covered kayaks, built by coastal communities who had watched these animals for generations before ever attempting to follow them out to sea. Some of those communities built entire belief systems around the whale, treating an encounter with one as a meeting with something worth deep respect, not a target. It took a much later kind of vessel, one built for a different purpose entirely, to turn that relationship into something else. So maybe that whale near the Essex in 1820 wasn't confused. Maybe it wasn't provoked by nothing, the way the old stories like to frame it. Maybe it was an animal from an ancient orderly world, reacting to a completely new kind of intruder, a wooden hull cutting through water that had belonged, uncontested, to creatures like it for 50 million years. You didn't arrive into their story first. They were already here, singing to each other in the dark, carrying their calves along paths older than language, long before anything with a hull ever crossed their path. If you have ever stood near the ocean and felt small in a way that wasn't frightening, just honest, that feeling has a much older history than you might think. Leave a comment and tell me about a moment like that. a time an animal made you feel like you were the visitor and not the other way around. And if this changed the way you'll think about whales the next time you see one, a like helps this reach someone who needs to feel that too.